His supreme enemy was Monsieur l'Économe, which was nothing particularly to his credit since everybody hated this individual. For companion Malussi had one called Le Pénible, a dour-looking chap with a hawk-like profile who practiced the strictest economy and acted as money-lender. He was like an engraving by Albrecht Dürer, a composite of all the dour, sour, morose, bitter, unfortunate, unlucky and introspective devils who compose the pantheon of Germany's medieval knights. A Jew, no doubt. At any rate, he was killed in an automobile accident shortly after my arrival, a circumstance which left me 23 francs to the good. With the exception of Renaud, who sat beside me, the others have faded out of my memory. They belonged to that category of colorless individuals who make up the world of engineers, architects, dentists, pharmacists, teachers, etc. There was nothing to distinguish them from the clods whom they would later wipe their boots on. They were zeros in every sense of the word, ciphers who form the nucleus of a respectable and lamentable citizenry. They ate with their heads down and were always the first to clamor for a second helping. They slept soundly and never complained. They were neither gay nor miserable. They indifferent ones whom Dante consigned to the vestibule of hell. The upper crusters. It was the custom after dinner to go immediately to town, unless one was on duty in the dormitories. In the center of town were the cafés, huge, dreary halls where the somnolent merchants of Dijon gathered to play cards and listen to music. It was warm in the cafés, that is the best I can say for them. The seats were fairly comfortable, too. And there were always a few whores about who, for a glass of beer or a cup of coffee, would sit and chew the fat with you. The music, on the other hand, was atrocious. Such music! On a winter's night, in a dirty hole like Dijon, nothing can be more harassing, more nerve-wracking, than the sound of a French orchestra. Particularly one of those lugubrious female orchestras with everything coming in squeaks and farts, with the dry, algebraic rhythm and the hygienic consistency of toothpaste. A wheezing and scraping performed at so many francs the hour, and the devil take the hindmost. The melancholy of it! As if old Euclid had stood up on his hind legs and swallowed prussic acid. The whole realm of ideas so thoroughly exploited by the reason that there is nothing left of which to make music except the empty slats of the accordion, through which the wind whistles and tears the ether to tatters. However, to speak of music in connection with this outpost is like dreaming of champagne when you are in the death cell. Music was the least of my worries. I didn't even think of Kant, so dismal, so chill, so barren, so grey was it all. On the way home the first night I noticed on the door of a café an inscription from the Gargantua. Inside the café it was like a morgue. However, forward. I had plenty of time on my hands and not a sou to spend. 2 or 3 hours of conversational lessons a day, and that was all. And what use was it, teaching these poor bastards English? I felt sorry as hell for them. All morning plugging away on John Gilpin's ride, and in the afternoon coming to me to practice a dead language. I thought of the good time I had wasted reading Virgil or wading through such incomprehensible nonsense as Hermann und Dorothea. The insanity of it. Learning, the empty breadbasket. I thought of Carl, who can recite Faust backwards, who never writes a book without praising the shit out of his immortal, incorruptible Goethe. And yet he hadn't sense enough to take on a rich cunt and get himself a change of underwear. There's something obscene in this love of the past which ends in bread lines and dugouts. Something obscene about this spiritual racket which permits an idiot to sprinkle holy water over big Berthas and dreadnoughts and high explosives. Every man with a belly full of the classics is an enemy to the human race. Here was I, supposedly to spread the gospel of Franco-American amity 226. The emissary of a corpse who, after he had plundered right and left, after he had caused untold suffering and misery, dreamed of establishing universal peace. Pfui! What did they expect me to talk about, I wonder? About leaves of grass, about the tariff walls, about the Declaration of Independence, about the latest gang war? What? Just what, I'd like to know. Well, I'll tell you, I never mentioned these things. I started right off the bat with a lesson in the physiology of love. How the elephants make love. That was it. It caught like wildfire. After the first day there were no more empty benches. After that first lesson in English they were standing at the door waiting for me. We got along swell together. They asked all sorts of questions, as though they had never learned a damned thing. I let them fire away. I taught them to ask still more ticklish questions. Ask anything. That was my motto. I'm here as a plenipotentiary from the realm of free spirits. I'm here to create a fever and a ferment. In some way, says an eminent astronomer, the material universe appears to be passing away. Like a tale that is told, dissolving into nothingness like a vision. That seems to be the general feeling underlying the empty breadbasket of learning. Myself, I don't believe it. I don't believe a fucking thing these bastards try to shove down our throats. Between sessions, if I had no book to read, I would go upstairs to the dormitory and chat with the peons. They were delightfully ignorant of all that was going on, especially in the world of art. Almost as ignorant as the students themselves. It was as if I had gotten into a private little madhouse with no exit signs. Sometimes I snooped around under the arcades, watching the kids marching along with huge hunks of bread stuck in their dirty mugs. I was always hungry myself, since it was impossible for me to go to breakfast, which was handed out at some ungodly hour of the morning, just when the bed was getting toasty. Huge bowls of blue coffee with chunks of white bread and no butter to go with it. For lunch, beans or lentils with bits of meat thrown in to make it look appetizing. Food fit for a chain gang, for rock breakers. Even the wine was lousy. Things were either diluted or bloated. There were calories, but no cuisine. L'Econome was responsible for it all. So they said. I don't believe that, either. He was paid to keep our heads just above the water line. He didn't ask if we were suffering from piles or carbuncles. He didn't inquire if we had delicate palates or the intestines of wolves. Why should he? He was hired at so many grams the plate to produce so many kilowatts of energy. Everything in terms of horsepower. It was all carefully reckoned in the fat ledgers which the pasty-faced clerks scribbled in morning, noon, and night. Debit and credit, with a red line down the middle of the page. Roaming around the quadrangle with an empty belly most of the time, I got to feel slightly mad. Like Charles the Silly, poor devil, only I had no Odette Champs divers with whom to play stink finger. Half the time I had to grub cigarettes from the students, and during the lessons. Sometimes I munched a bit of dry bread with them. As the fire was always going out on me, I soon used up my allotment of wood. It was the devil's own time coaxing a little wood out of the ledger clerks. Finally I got so riled up about it that I would go out in the street and hunt for firewood, like an Arab. Astonishing how little firewood you could pick up in the streets of Dijon. However, these little foraging expeditions brought me into strange precincts, got to know the little street named after A.M. Philibert Papillon, a dead musician, I believe, where there was a cluster of whorehouses. It was always more cheerful hereabouts, there was the smell of cooking and wash hanging out to dry. Once in a while I caught a glimpse of the poor half-wits who lounged about inside. They were better off than the poor devils in the center of town whom I used to bump into whenever I walked through a department store. I did that frequently in order to get warm. They were doing it for the same reason, I suppose. Looking for someone to buy them a coffee. They looked a little crazy, with the cold and the loneliness. The whole town looked a bit crazy when the blue of evening settled over it. You could walk up and down the main drive any Thursday in the week till doomsday and never meet an expansive soul. 60 or 70,000 people, perhaps more, wrapped in woolen underwear and nowhere to go and nothing to do, turning out mustard by the carload. Female orchestras grinding out the Merry Widow. Silver service in the big hotels. The ducal palace rotting away, stone by stone, limb by limb. The trees screeching with frost. A ceaseless clatter of wooden shoes. The university celebrating the death of Goethe, or the birth, I don't remember which. Usually it's the deaths that are celebrated. Idiotic affair, anyway. Everybody yawning and stretching. Coming through the high driveway into the quadrangle, a sense of abysmal futility always came over me. Outside bleak and empty, inside, bleak and empty. A scummy sterility hanging over the town, a fog of book learning. Slag and cinders of the past. Around the interior courts were ranged the classrooms, little shacks such as you might see in the North Woods, where the pedagogues gave free rein to their vices. On the blackboard the feudal abracadabra which the future citizens of the Republic would have to spend their lives forgetting. Once in a while the parents were received in the big reception room just off the driveway, where there were busts of the heroes of antiquity, such as Molière, Racine, Corneille, Voltaire, etc., all the scarecrows whom the cabinet ministers mention with moist lips whenever an immortal is added to the waxworks. No bust of Villon, no bust of Rabelais, no bust of Rimbaud. Anyway, they met here in solemn conclave, the parents and the Stuffed shirts whom the state hires to bend the minds of the young. Always. This bending process, this landscape gardening to make the mind more attractive. And the youngsters came too, occasionally the little sunflowers, who would soon be transplanted from the nursery in order to decorate the municipal grass plots. Some of them were just rubber plants easily dusted with a torn chemise. All of them jerking away for dear life in the dormitories. As soon as night came on, the dormitories, where the red lights glowed, where the bell rang like a fire alarm, where the treads were hollowed out, in the scramble to reach the educational cells. Then there were the profs. During the first few days I got so far as to shake hands with a few of them, and of course there was always the salute with the hat when we passed under the arcades. But as for a heart-to-heart talk, as for walking to the corner and having a drink together, nothing doing. It was simply unimaginable. Most of them looked as though they had had the shit scared out of them. Anyway, I belonged to another hierarchy. They wouldn't even share a louse with the likes of me. They made me so damned irritated, just to look at them, that I used to curse them under my breath. When I saw them coming, I used to stand there, leaning against a pillar, with a cigarette in the corner of my mouth and my hat down over my eyes, and when they got within hailing distance I would let squirt a good gob and up. With the hat I didn't even bother to open my trap and bid them the time of the day. Under my breath I simply said, "Fuck you, Jack," and let it go at that. After a week it seemed as if I had been here all my life. It was like a bloody fucking nightmare that you can't throw off. Used to fall into a coma thinking about it. Just a few days ago I had arrived. Nightfall. People scurrying home like rats under the foggy lights. The trees glittering with diamond-pointed malice. I thought it all out, 1,000 times or more. From the station to the lycée it was like a promenade through the Danzig corridor, all decal edged, crannied, nerve-ridden. A lane of dead bones, of crooked, cringing figures buried in shrouds. Spines made of sardine bones. The lycée itself seemed to rise up out of a lake of thin snow, an inverted mountain that pointed down toward the center of the earth where God or the devil works. Always in a straitjacket grinding grist for that paradise which is always a wet dream. If the sun ever shone I don't remember it. I remember nothing but the cold greasy fogs that blew in from the frozen marshes over yonder, where the railroad tracks burrowed into the lurid hills. Down near the station was a canal, or perhaps it was a river, hidden away under a yellow sky, with little shacks pasted slap up against the rising ledge of the banks. There was a barracks too somewhere, it struck me, because every now and then I met little yellow men from Cochin China, squirmy, opium-faced runts peeping out of their baggy uniforms like dyed skeletons packed in Excelsior. The whole goddamned medievalism of the place was infernally ticklish and restive, rocking back and forth with low moans, jumping out at you from the eaves, hanging like broken-necked criminals from the gargoyles. I kept looking back all the time, kept walking like a crab that you prong with a dirty fork. All those fat little monsters, those slab like effigies pasted on the facade of the Église Saint-Michel, they were following me down the crooked lanes and around corners. The whole facade of Saint Michel seemed to open up like an album at night, leaving you face to face with the horrors of the printed page. When the lights went out, and the characters faded away flat, dead as words, then it was quite magnificent, the facade. In every crevice of the old gnarled front there was the hollow chant of the night wind, and over the lacy rubble of cold stiff vestments there was a cloudy absinthe-like drool of fog and frost. Here, where the church stood, everything seemed turned hind-side front. The church itself must have been twisted off its base by centuries of progress in the rain and snow. It lay in the place Edgar Quinet, squat against the wind, like a dead mule. Through the Rue de la Monnaie the wind rushed like white hair streaming wild. It whirled around the white hitching posts which obstructed the free passage of omnibuses and 20 mule teams. Swinging through this exit, in the early morning hours I sometimes stumbled upon Monsieur Renaud, who, wrapped in his cowl like a gluttonous monk, made overtures to me in the language of the 16th century. Falling in step with Monsieur Renaud, the moon busting through the greasy sky like a punctured balloon, I fell immediately into the realm of the transcendental. M. Renaud had a precise speech, dry as apricots, with a heavy Brandenburger bass. Used to come at me full tilt from Goethe or Fichte, with deep bass notes that rumbled in the windy corners of the place like claps of last year's thunder. Men of Yucatan, men of Zanzibar, men of Tierra del Fuego, save me from this glaucous hog rind. The north piles up about me, the glacial fjords, the blue-tipped spines, the crazy lights, the obscene Christian chant that spread like an avalanche from Etna to the Aegean. Everything frozen tight as scum, the mind locked and rhymed with frost, and through the melancholy bales of chitterwit the choking gargle of Laocoon saints. White I am and wrapped in wool, swaddled, fettered, hamstrung, but in this I have no part. White to the bone, but with a cold alkali base, with saffron-tipped fingers. White, I, but no brother of learning, no Catholic heart. White and ruthless, as the men before me who sailed out of the Elbe. I look to the sea, to the sky, to what is unintelligible and distantly near. The snow underfoot scurries before the wind, blows, tickles, stings, lisps away, whirls aloft, showers, splinters, sprays down. No sun, no roar of surf, no breaker's surge. The cold north wind pointed with barbed shafts, icy, malevolent, greedy, blighting, paralyzing. The streets turn away on their crooked elbows, they break from the hurried sight, the stem glance. They hobble away down the drifting lattice work, wheeling the church hindside front, mowing down the statues, flattening the monuments, uprooting the trees, stiffening the grass, sucking the fragrance out of the earth. Leaves dull as cement, leaves no dew can bring to glisten again. No moon will ever silver their listless plight. The seasons are come to a stagnant stop, the trees blench and wither, the wagons roll in the mica ruts with slithering harp-like thuds. In the hollow of the white-tipped hills, lurid and boneless Dijon slumbers. No man alive and walking through the night except the restless spirits moving southward towards the sapphire grids. Yet I am up and about. A walking ghost, a white man terrorized by the cold sanity of this slaughter house geometry. Who am I? What am I doing here? I fall between the cold Walls of human malevolence, a white figure fluttering, sinking down through the cold lake, a mountain of skulls above me. I settle down to the cold latitudes, the chalk steps washed with indigo. The earth in its dark corridors knows my step, feels a foot abroad, a wing stirring, a gasp, and a shudder. I hear the learning chafed and huzzled, the figures mounting upward, bat. Slime dripping aloft and clanging with pasteboard golden wings, I hear the trains collide, the chains rattle, the locomotive chugging, snorting, sniffing, steaming and pissing. All things come to me through the clear fog with the odor of repetition, with yellow hangovers and gadzooks and wedikins. 233. In the dead center, far below Dijon, far below the Hyperborean 234 regions, stands god Ajax, his shoulders strapped to the mill wheel, the olives crunching, the green marsh water alive with croaking frogs. The fog and snow, the cold latitude, the heavy learning, the blue coffee, the unbuttered bread, the soup and lentils, the heavy pork packer beans, the stale cheese, the soggy chow, the lousy wine has put the whole penitentiary into a state of constipation. And just when everyone has become shit-tight, the toilet pipes freeze. The shit piles up like ant hills, one has to move down from the little pedestals and leave it on the floor. It lies there stiff and frozen, waiting for the thaw. On Thursdays the hunchback comes with his little wheelbarrow, shovels the cold, stiff turds with a broom and pan, and trundles off dragging his withered leg. The corridors are littered with toilet paper, it sticks to your feet like fly paper. When the weather moderates, the odor gets ripe, you can smell it in Winchester 40 miles away. Standing over that ripe dung in the morning, with a toothbrush, the stench is so powerful that it makes your head spin. We stand around in red flannel shirts, waiting to spit down the hole. It is like an aria from one of Verdi's operas, an anvil chorus with pulleys and syringes. In the night, when I am taken short, I rush down to the private toilet of M. L.E. Censeur, just off the driveway. My stool is always full of blood. His toilet doesn't flush either, but at least there is the pleasure of sitting down. I leave my little bundle for him as a token of esteem. Towards the end of the meal each evening the Valor de Newt 235 drops in for his bit of cheer. This is the only human being in the whole institution with whom I feel a kinship. He is a nobody. He carries a lantern and a bunch of keys. He makes the rounds through the night, stiff as an automaton. About the time the stale cheese is being passed around, in he pops for his glass of wine. He stands there, with paw outstretched, his hair stiff and wiry, like a mastiff's, his cheeks ruddy, his mustache gleaming with snow. He mumbles a word or two and Quasimodo brings him the bottle. Then, with feet solidly planted, he throws back his head and down it goes, slowly in one long draught. To me it's like he's pouring rubies down his gullet. Something about this gesture which seizes me by the hair. It's almost as if he were drinking down the dregs of human sympathy, as if all the love and compassion in the world could be tossed off like that, in one gulp, as if that were all that could be squeezed together day after day. A little less than a rabbit they have made him. In the scheme of things he's not worth the brine to pickle a herring. He's just a piece of live manure. And he knows it. When he looks around after his drink and smiles at us, the world seems to be falling to pieces. It's a smile thrown across an abyss. The whole stinking, civilized world lies like a quagmire at the bottom of the pit, and over it, like a mirage, hovers this wavering smile. It was the same smile which greeted me at night when I returned from my rambles. I remember one such night when, standing at the door waiting for the old fellow to finish his rounds, I had such a sense of well-being that I could have waited thus forever. I had to wait perhaps half an hour before he opened the door. I looked about me calmly and leisurely, drank everything in, the dead tree in front of the school with its twisted rope branches, the houses across the street which had changed color during the night, which curved now more noticeably, the sound of a train rolling through the Siberian wastes, the railings painted by Utrillo, the sky, the deep wagon ruts. Suddenly, out of nowhere, two lovers appeared. Every few yards they stopped and embraced, and when I could no longer follow them with my eyes, I followed the sound of their steps, heard the abrupt stop, and then the slow, meandering gait. I could feel the sag and slump of their bodies when they leaned against a rail, heard their shoes creak as the muscles tightened for the embrace. Through the town they wandered, through the crooked streets, towards the glassy canal where the water lay black as coal. There was something phenomenal about it. In all Dijon not two like them. Meanwhile the old fellow was making the rounds. I could hear the jingle of his keys, the crunching of his boots, the steady, automatic tread. Finally I heard him coming through the driveway to open the big door, a monstrous arched portal without a moat in front of it. I heard him fumbling at the lock, his hands stiff, his mind numbed. As the door swung open I saw over his head a brilliant constellation crowning the chapel. Every door was locked, every cell bolted. The books were closed. The night hung close, dagger pointed, drunk as a maniac. There it was, the infinitude of emptiness. Over the chapel, like a bishop's mitre, hung the constellation. Every night, during the winter months, it hung there low over the chapel. Low and bright, a handful of dagger points, a dazzle of pure emptiness. The old fellow followed me to the turn of the drive. The door closed silently. As I bade him good night I caught that desperate, hopeless smile again, like a meteoric flash over the rim of a lost world. And again I saw him standing in the refectory, his head thrown back and the rubies pouring down his gullet. The whole Mediterranean seemed to be buried inside him, the orange groves, the cypress trees, the winged statues, the wooden temples, the blue sea, the stiff masks, the mystic numbers, the mythological birds, the sapphire skies, the eaglets, the sunny coves, the blind bards, the bearded heroes. Gone all that. Sunk beneath the avalanche from the north. Buried, dead. Forever. A memory. A wild hope. For just a moment I linger at the carriageway. The shroud, the pall, 238. The unspeakable, clutching emptiness of it all. Then I walk quickly along the gravel path near the wall, past the arches and columns, the iron staircases. From one quadrangle to the other, everything is locked tight. Locked for the winter. I find the arcade leading to the dormitory. A sickish light spills down over the stairs from the grimy, frosted windows. Everywhere the paint is peeling off. The stones are hollowed out, the banister creaks, a damp sweat oozes from the flagging and forms a pale, fuzzy aura pierced by the feeble red light at the head of the stairs. I mount the last flight, the turret. In a sweat and terror. In pitch darkness I grope my way through the deserted corridor, every room empty, locked, molding away. My hand slides along the wall seeking the keyhole. A panic comes over me as I grasp the doorknob. Always a hand at my collar ready to yank me back. Once inside the room I bolt the door. It's a miracle which I perform each night. The miracle of getting inside without being strangled, without being struck down by an axe. I can hear the rats scurrying through the corridor, gnawing away over my head between the thick rafters. The light glares like burning sulfur, and there is the sweet, sickish stench of a room which is never ventilated. In the corner stands the coal box, just as I left it. The fire is out. A silence so intense that it sounds like Niagara Falls in my ears. Alone, with a tremendous empty longing and dread. The whole room for my thoughts. Nothing but myself and what I think, what I fear. Could think. The most fantastic thoughts, could dance, spit, grimace, curse, wail. Nobody would ever know, nobody would ever hear. The thought of such absolute privacy is enough to drive me mad. It's like a clean birth. Everything cut away. Separate, naked, alone. Bliss and agony simultaneously. Time on your hands. Each second weighing on you like a mountain. You drown in it. Deserts, seas, lakes, oceans. Time beating away like a meat axe. Nothingness. The world. The me and the not me. Omaharamoma. Everything has to have a name. Everything has to be learned, tested, experienced. Fates come chez vous, chérie. The silence descends in volcanic chutes. Yonder, in the barren hills, rolling onward towards the great metallurgical regions, the locomotives are pulling their merchant products over steel and iron beds they roll, the ground sown with slag and cinders and purple ore. In the baggage car, kelps, fish plate, rolled iron, sleepers, wire rods, plates and sheets, laminated articles, hot rolled hoops, splints and mortar carriages, and zors. Or the wheels U80 mm or over. Pass splendid specimens of Anglo Norman architecture, pass pedestrians and pederasts, open hearth furnaces, basic Bessemer mills, dynamos and transformers, pig iron castings, and steel ingots. The public at large, pedestrians and pederasts, goldfish and spun glass. Palm trees, donkeys sobbing, all circulating freely through quincunchal alleys. At the Place du Brésil a lavender eye. Going back in a flash over the women I've known. It's like a chain which I've forged out of my own misery. Each one bound to the other. A fear of living separate, of staying born. The door of the womb always on the latch. Dread and longing. Deep in the blood the pull of paradise. The beyond. Always the beyond. It must have all started with the navel. They cut the umbilical cord. Give you a slap on the ass, and presto. You're out in the world, adrift, a ship. Without a rudder. You look at the stars and then you look at your navel. You. The Bessemer process was the first. Inexpensive industrial process for the mass production of steel from molten pig iron before the development of the open hearth furnace. The key principle is removal of impurities from the iron by oxidation with air being blown through the molten iron. The oxidation also raises the temperature of the iron mass and keeps it molten. Pear orchard planted in quincunx pattern. From whatever direction you watch it, they presents straight lines. Grow eyes everywhere in the armpits, between your lips, in the roots of your hair, on the soles of your feet. What is distant becomes near, what is near becomes distant. Inner outer, a constant flux, a shedding of skins, a turning inside out. You drift around like that for years and years, until you find yourself in the dead center, and there you slowly rot, slowly crumble to pieces, get dispersed again. Only your name remains. It was spring before I managed to escape from the penitentiary, and then only by a stroke of fortune. A telegram from Carl informed me one day that there was a vacancy upstairs. He said he would send me the fare back if I decided to accept. I telegraphed back at once, and as soon as the dough arrived I beat it to the station. Not a word to MLE provisor or anyone. French leave, as they say. I went immediately to the hotel at 1 bis, where Carl was staying. He came to the door stark naked. It was his night off and there was a cunt in the bed. As usual. Don't mind her, he says, she's asleep. If you need a lay you can take her on. She's not bad. He pulls the covers back to show me what she looks like. However, I wasn't thinking about a lay right away. I was too excited. I was like a man who has just escaped from jail. I just wanted to see and hear things. Coming from the station it was like a long dream. I felt as though I had been away for years. It was not until I had sat down and taken a good look at the room that I realized I was back again in Paris. It was Carl's room and no mistake about it. Like a squirrel cage and shithouse combined. There was hardly room on the table for the portable machine he used. It was always like that, whether he had a cunt with him or not. Always a dictionary lying open on a gilt-edged volume of Faust, always a tobacco pouch, a beret, a bottle of vin rouge, letters, manuscripts, old newspapers, watercolors, teapot, dirty socks, toothpicks, Crustacean salts, condoms, etc. Crustacean salts help prevent heat cramps caused by too much sweating. In the bidet were orange peels and the remnants of a ham sandwich. There's some food in the closet, he said. Help yourself. I was just going to give myself an injection. I found the sandwich he was talking about and a piece of cheese that he had nibbled at beside it. While he sat on the edge of the bed, dosing himself with his Argirol, I put away the sandwich and cheese with the aid of a little wine. I liked that letter you sent me about Gerda, he said, wiping his prick with a dirty pair of drawers. I'll show you the answer to it in a minute. I'm putting it in my book. The trouble with you is that you're not a German. You have to be German to understand Gerda. Shit, I'm not going to explain it to you now. I've put it all in the book. By the way, I've got a new cunt now, not this one. This one's a half-wit. At least I had her until a few days ago. I'm not sure now whether she'll come back. Or not. She was living here with me all the time you were away. The other day her parents came and took her away. They said she was only 15. Can you beat that? They scared the shit out of me too. I began to laugh. It was like Carl to get himself into a mess like that. What are you laughing for? He said. I may go to prison for it. Luckily, I didn't knock her up. And that's funny, too, because she never took care of herself properly. But do you know what saved me? So I think, at least. It was Faust. Yet. Her old man happened to see it lying on the table. He asked me if I understood German. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, he was looking through my books. Fortunately, I happened to have the Shakespeare open too. That impressed him like hell. He said I was evidently a very serious guy. What about the girl? What did she have to say? She was frightened to death. You see, she had a little watch with her when she came. In the excitement we couldn't find the watch, and her mother insisted that the watch be found or she'd call the police. You see how things are, Giro, to resolve local infections in mucous membrane-lined organs. Most widely publicized for its value to combat gonorrhea infections and to prevent gonorrheal blindness and other pathogenic infections to the eyes of newborn infants are here. I turned the whole place upside down, but I couldn't find the goddamned watch. The mother was furious. I liked her too, in spite of everything. She was even better looking than the daughter. Here, I'll show you a letter I started to write her. I'm in love with her. With the mother. Sure. Why not? If I had seen the mother first, I'd never have looked at the daughter. How did I know she was only 15? You don't ask a cunt how old she is before you lay her. Do you? Joe, there's something funny about this. You're not shitting me, are you? Am I shitting you? Here, look at this. And he shows me the watercolors. The girl had made cute little things, a knife and a loaf of bread, the table and teapot, everything running uphill. She was in love with me, he said. She was just like a child. I had to tell her when to brush her teeth and how to put her hat on. Here, look at the lollipops. I used to buy her a few lollipops every day. She liked them. Well, what did she do when her parents came to take her away? Didn't she put up a row? She cried a little, that's all. What could she do? She's underage. I had to promise never to see her again, never to write her either. That's what I'm waiting to see now, whether she'll stay away or not. She was a virgin when she came here. The thing is, how long will she be able to go without a lay? She couldn't get enough of it when she was here. She almost wore me out. By this time the one in bed had come to and was rubbing her eyes. She looked pretty young to me, too. Not bad looking, but dumb as hell. Wanted to know right away what we were talking about. She lives here in the hotel, said Carl. On the 3rd floor. Do you want to go to her room? I'll fix it up for you. I didn't know whether I wanted to or not, but when I saw Carl mushing it up with her again, I decided I did want to. I asked her first if she was too tired. Useless question. A whore is never too tired to open her legs. Some of them can fall asleep while you diddle them. Anyway, it was decided we would go down to her room. Like that I wouldn't have to pay the patron for the night. In the morning I rented a room overlooking the little park down below, where the sandwich board men always came to eat their lunch. At noon I called for Carl to have breakfast with him. He and Van Norden had developed a new habit in my absence. They went to the Koepel for breakfast every day. Why the Koepel? I asked. Why the Koepel? Says Carl. Because the Koepel serves porridge at all hours and porridge makes you shit. I see, said I. So it's just like it used to be again. The three of us walking back and forth to work. Petty dissensions, petty rivalries. Van Norden still belly-aching about his cunts and about washing the dirt out of his belly. Only now he's found a new diversion. He's found that it's less annoying to masturbate. I was amazed when he broke the news to me. I didn't think it possible for a guy like that to find any pleasure in jerking himself off. I was still more amazed when he explained to me how he goes about it. He had invented a new stunt, so he put it. You take an apple, he says, and you bore out the core. Then you rub some cold cream on the inside so as it doesn't melt too fast. Try it sometime. It'll drive you crazy at first. Anyway, it's cheap and you don't have to waste much time. By the way, he says, switching the subject, that friend of yours, Fillmore. He's in the hospital. I think he's nuts. Anyway, that's what his girl told me. He took on a French girl, you know, while you were away. They used to fight like hell. She's a big, healthy bitch wild-like. I wouldn't mind giving her a tumble, but I'm afraid she'd claw the eyes out of me. He was always going around with his face and hands scratched up. She looks bunged up too once in a while, or she used to. You know how these French cunts are when they love, they lose their minds. Evidently things had happened while I was away. I was sorry to hear about Fillmore. He had been damned good to me. When I left Van Norden I jumped a bus and went straight to the hospital. They hadn't decided yet whether he was completely off his base or not, I suppose, for I found him upstairs in a private room, enjoying all the liberties of the regular patients. He had just come from the bath when I arrived. When he caught sight of me he burst into tears. It's all over, he says immediately. They say I'm crazy and I may have syphilis too. They say I have delusions of grandeur. He fell over onto the bed and wept quietly. After he had wept a while he lifted his head up and smiled just like a bird coming out of a snooze. Why do they put me in such an expensive room? He said. Why don't they put me in the ward or in the bug house? I can't afford to pay for this. I'm down to my last $500. That's why they're keeping you here, I said. They'll transfer you quickly. Enough when your money runs out. Don't worry. My words must have impressed him, for I had no sooner finished than he handed me his watch and chain, his wallet, his fraternity pin, etc. Hold on to them, he said. These bastards'll rob me of everything I've got. And then suddenly he began to laugh, one of those weird, mirthless laughs which makes you believe a guy's goofy whether he is or not. I know you'll think I'm crazy, he said, but I want to atone for what I did. I want to get married. You see, I didn't know I had the clap. I gave her the clap and then I knocked her up. I told the doctor I don't care what happens to me, but I want him to let me get married first. He keeps telling me to wait until I get better, but I know I'm never going to get better. This is the end. I couldn't help laughing myself, hearing him talk that way. I couldn't understand what had come over him. Anyway, I had to promise him to see the girl and explain things to her. He wanted me to stick by her, comfort her, said he could trust me, etc. I said yes to everything in order to soothe him. He didn't seem exactly nuts to me, just caved in like typical Anglo-Saxon crisis. An eruption of morals. I was rather curious to see the girl, to get the lowdown on the whole thing. The next day I looked her up. She was living in the Latin Quarter. As soon as she realized who I was, she became exceedingly cordial. Jeanette, she called herself. Rather big, raw-boned, healthy, peasant type with a front tooth half eaten away. Full of vitality and a kind of crazy fire in her eyes. The first thing she did was to weep. Then, seeing that I was an old friend of her, Jojo, that was how she called him, she ran downstairs and brought back a couple of bottles of white wine. I was to stay and have dinner with her. She insisted on it. As she drank, she became by turns gay and maudlin. 240. I didn't have to ask her any questions. She went on like a self-winding machine. The thing that worried her principally was, would he get his job back when he was released from the hospital? She said her parents were well off, but they were displeased with her. They didn't approve of her wild ways. They didn't approve of him particularly. He had no manners, and he was an American. She begged me to assure her that he would get his job back, which I did without hesitancy. And then she begged me to know if she could believe what he said, that he was going to marry her. Because now, with a child under her belt, and a dose of clap besides, she was in no position to strike a match with a Frenchman anyway. That was clear, wasn't it? Of course, I assured her. It was all clear as hell to me, except how in Christ's name Fillmore had ever fallen for her. However, one thing at a time. It was my duty now to comfort her, and so I just filled her up with a lot of baloney, told her everything would turn out all right and that I would stand godfather to the child, etc. Then suddenly it struck me as strange that she should have the child at all, especially as it was likely to be born blind. I told her that as tactfully as I could. It doesn't make any difference, she said. I want a child by him, even if it's blind. I asked. Monday tu, ne dites pas ca. She groaned. Ne dites pas ca. Just the same, I felt it was my duty to say it. She got hysterical and began to weep like a walrus, poured out more wine. In a few moments she was laughing boisterously. She was laughing to think how they used to fight when they got in bed. He liked me to fight with him, she said. He was a brute. As we sat down to eat, a friend of hers walked in, a little tart who lived at the end of the hall. Jeanette immediately sent me down to get some more wine. When I came back they had evidently had a good talk. Her friend, Yvette, worked in the police department. A sort of stool pigeon, as far as I could gather. At least that was what she was trying to make me believe. It Was fairly obvious that she was just a little whore. But she had an obsession about the police and their doings. Throughout the meal they were urging me to accompany them to a bal musette. They wanted to have a gay time. It was so lonely for Jeanette with Jojo in the hospital. I told them I had to work, but that on my night off I'd come back and take them out. I made it clear too that I had no dough to spend on them. Jeanette, who was really thunderstruck to hear this, pretended that didn't matter in the least. In fact, just to show what a good sport she was, she insisted on driving me to work in a cab. She was doing it because I was a friend of Jojo's. And therefore I was a friend of hers. And also, thought I to myself, if anything goes wrong with your Jojo you'll come to me on the double quick. Then you'll see what a friend I can be. I was as nice as pie to her. In fact, when we got out of the cab in front of the office, I permitted them to persuade me into having a final Pernod together. Yvette wanted to know if she couldn't call for me after work. She had a lot of things to tell me in confidence, she said. But I managed to refuse without hurting her feelings. Unfortunately I did unbend sufficiently to give her my address. Unfortunately, I say. As a matter of fact, I'm rather glad of it when I think back on it. Because the very next day things began to happen. The very next day, before I had even gotten out of bed, the two of them called on me. Joe had been removed from the hospital. They had incarcerated him in a little chateau in the country, just a few miles out of Paris. The chateau, they called it. A polite way of saying the bug house. They wanted me to get dressed immediately and go with them. They were in a panic. Perhaps I might have gone alone, but I just couldn't make up my mind to go with these two. I asked them to wait for me downstairs while I got dressed, thinking that it would give me time to invent some excuse for not going. But they wouldn't leave the room. They sat there and watched me wash and dress, just as if it were an everyday affair. In the midst of it, Carl popped in. I gave him the situation briefly, in English, and then we hatched up an excuse that I had some important work to do. However, to smooth things over, we got some wine in and we began to amuse them by showing them a book of dirty drawings. Yvette had already lost all desire to go to the chateau. She and Carl were getting along famously. When it came time to go, Carl decided to accompany them to the chateau. He thought it would be funny to see Fillmore walking around with a lot of nuts. He wanted to see what it was like in the nut house. So off they went, somewhat pickled, and in the best of humor. All the time that Fillmore was at the chateau I never once went to see him. It wasn't necessary, because Jeanette visited him regularly and gave me all the news. They had hopes of bringing him around in a few months, so she said. They thought it was alcoholic poisoning, nothing more. Of course, he had a dose, but that wasn't difficult to remedy. So far as they could see, he didn't have syphilis. That was something. So, to begin with, they used the stomach pump on him. They cleaned his system out thoroughly. He was so weak for a while that he couldn't get out of bed. He was depressed, too. He said he didn't want to be cured, he wanted to die. And he kept repeating this nonsense so insistently that finally they grew alarmed. I Suppose it wouldn't have been a very good recommendation if he had committed suicide. Anyway, they began to give him mental treatment. And in between times, they pulled out his teeth, more and more of them, until he didn't have a tooth left in his head. He was supposed to feel fine after that, yet strangely, he didn't. He became more despondent than ever. And then his hair began to fall out. Finally he developed a paranoid streak, began to accuse them of all sorts of things, demanded to know by what right he was being detained, what he had done to warrant being locked up, etc. After a terrible fit of despondency he would suddenly become energetic and threaten to blow up the place if they didn't release him. And to make it worse, as far as Jeanette was concerned, he had gotten all over his notion of marrying her. He told her straight up and down that he had no intention of marrying her. And that if she was crazy enough to go and have a child then she could support it herself. The doctors interpreted all this as a good sign. They said he was coming round. Jeanette, of course, thought he was crazier than ever. But she was praying for him to be released so that she could take him to the country where it would be quiet and peaceful and where he would come to his right senses. Meanwhile her parents had come to Paris on a visit and had even gone so far as to visit the future son-in-law at the chateau. In their canny way they had probably figured it out that it would be better for their daughter to have a crazy husband than no husband at all. The father thought he could find something for Fillmore to do on the farm. He said that Fillmore wasn't such a bad chap at all. When he learned from Jeanette that Fillmore's parents had money he became even more indulgent, more understanding. The thing was working itself out nicely all around. Jeanette returned to the provinces for a while with her parents. Yvette was coming regularly to the hotel to see Carl. She thought he was the editor of the paper. And little by little she became more confidential. When she got good and tight one day, she informed us that Jeanette had never been anything but a whore, that Jeanette was a bloodsucker, that Jeanette never had been pregnant and was not pregnant now. About the other accusations we hadn't much doubt, Carl and I, but about not being pregnant, that we weren't so sure of. How did she get such a big stomach, then? Asked Carl. Yvette laughed. Maybe she uses a bicycle pump, she said. No, seriously. She added, the stomach comes from drink. She drinks like a fish, Jeanette. When she comes back from the country, you will see, she will be blown up. Still more. Her father is a drunkard. Jeanette is a drunkard. Maybe she had the clap, yes, but she is not pregnant. But why does she want to marry him? Is she really in love with him? Love? Pfaba. She has no heart, Jeanette. She wants someone to look after her. No Frenchman would ever marry her. She has a police record. No, she wants him because he's too stupid to find out about her. Her parents don't want her anymore. She's a disgrace to them. But if she can get married to a rich American, then everything will be all right. You think maybe she loves him a little, eh? You don't know her. When they were living together at the hotel, she had men coming to her room while he was at work. She said he didn't give her enough spending money. He was stingy. That fur she wore, she told him her parents had given it to her, didn't she? Innocent fool. Why, I've seen her bring a man back to the hotel right while he was there. She brought the man to the floor below. I saw it with my own eyes. And what a man! An old derelict. He couldn't get an erection. If Fillmore, when he was released from the chateau, had returned to Paris, perhaps I might have tipped him off about his Jeanette. While he was still under observation, I didn't think it well to upset him by poisoning his mind with Yvette's slanders. As things turned out, he went directly from the chateau to the home of Jeanette's parents. There, despite himself, he was inveigled into making public his engagement. The banns were published in the local papers and a reception was given to the friends of the family. Fillmore took advantage of the situation to indulge in all sorts of escapades. Though he knew quite well what he was doing, he pretended to be still a little daffy. He would borrow his father-in-law's car, for example, and tear about the countryside all by himself. If he saw a town that he liked, he would plank himself down and have a good time until Jeanette came searching for him. Sometimes the father-in-law and he would go off together on a fishing trip, presumably, and nothing would be heard of them for days. He became exasperatingly capricious and exacting. I suppose he figured he might as well get what he could out of it. When he returned to Paris with Jeanette, he had a complete new wardrobe and a pocket full of dough. He looked cheerful and healthy, and had a fine coat of tan. He looked sound as a berry to me. But as soon as we had gotten away from Jeanette, he opened up. His job was gone and his money had all run out. In a month or so they were to be married. Meanwhile the parents were supplying the dough. Once they've got me properly in their clutches, he said, I'll be nothing but a slave to them. The father thinks he's going to open up a stationery store for me. Jeanette will handle the customers, take in the money, etc., while I sit in the back of the store and write or something. Can you picture me sitting in the back of a stationery store for the rest of my life? Jeanette thinks it's an excellent idea. She likes to handle money. I'd rather go back to the chateau than submit to such a scheme. For the time being, of course, he was pretending that everything was hunky-dory. I tried to persuade him to go back to America, but he wouldn't hear of that. He said he wasn't going to be driven out of France by a lot of ignorant peasants. He had an idea that he would slip out of sight for a while and then take up quarters in some outlying section of the city where he'd not be likely to stumble upon her. But we soon decided that that was impossible. You can't hide away in France as you can in America. You could go to Belgium for a while, I suggested. But what'll I do for money? He said promptly. You can't get a job in these goddamned countries. Why don't you marry her and get a divorce, then? I asked. And meanwhile she'll be dropping a kid. Who's going to take care of the kid, et? How do you know she's going to have a kid? I said, determined now that the moment had come to spill the beans. How do I know? He said. He didn't quite seem to know what I was insinuating. I gave him an inkling of what Yvette had said. He listened to me in complete bewilderment. Finally he interrupted me. It's no use going on with that, he said. I know she's going to have a kid, all right. I've felt it kicking around inside. Yvette's a dirty little slut. You see, I didn't want to tell you, but up Until the time I went to the hospital I was shelling out for Yvette too. Then, when the crash came I couldn't do any more for her. I figured out that I had done enough for the both of them. I made up my mind to look after myself first. That made Yvette sore. She told Jeanette that she was going to get even with me. No, I wish it were true, what she said. Then I could get out of this thing more easily. Now I'm in a trap. I've promised to marry her and I'll have to go through with it. After that I don't know what'll happen to me. They've got me by the balls now. Since he had taken a room in the same hotel with me I was obliged to see them frequently, whether I wanted to or not. Almost every evening I had dinner with them, preceded, of course, by a few pernod. All through the meal they quarreled noisily. It was embarrassing because I had sometimes to take one side and sometimes the other. One Sunday afternoon, for example, after we had had lunch together, we repaired to a cafe on the corner of the boulevard Edgar Quinet. Things had gone unusually well this time. We were sitting inside at a little table, one alongside the other, our backs to a mirror. Jeanette must have been passionate or something, for she had suddenly gotten into a sentimental mood and was fondling him and kissing him in front of everybody, as the French do so naturally. They had just come out of a long embrace when Fillmore said something about her parents which she interpreted as an insult. Immediately her cheeks flushed with anger. We tried to mollify her by telling her that she had misunderstood the remark, and then, under his breath, Fillmore said something to me in English, something about giving her a little soft soap. That was enough to set her completely off the handle. She said we were making fun of her. I said something sharp to her which angered her still more, and then Fillmore tried to put in a word. "You're too quick-tempered," he said, and he tried to pat her on the cheek. But she, thinking that he had raised his hand to slap her face, she gave him a sound crack in the jaw with that big peasant hand of hers. For a moment, he was stunned. He hadn't expected a wallop like that, and it stung. I saw his face go white, and the next moment he raised himself from the bench, and with the palm of his hand he gave her such a crack that she almost fell off her seat. "There! That'll teach you how to behave," he said in his broken French. For a moment there was a dead silence. Then, like a storm breaking, she picked up the cognac glass in front of her and hurled it at him with all her might. It smashed against the mirror behind us. Fillmore had already grabbed her by the arm, but with her free hand she grabbed the coffee glass and smashed it on the floor. She was squirming around like a maniac. It was all we could do to hold her down. Meanwhile, of course, the patron had come running in and ordered us to beat it. "Loafers!" he called us. "Yes, loafers, that's it!" screamed Jeanette. "Dirty foreigners! Thugs! Gangsters! Striking a pregnant woman!" We were getting black looks all around. A poor French woman with 2 American toughs. Gangsters! I was wondering how the hell we'd ever get out of the place without a fight. Fillmore, by this time, was as silent as a clam. Jeanette was bolting it through the door, leaving us to face the music. As she sailed out she turned back. With fist upraised and shouted, "I'll pay you back for this, you brute! You'll see. No foreigner can treat a decent French woman like that. Ah, no. Not like that." Hearing this, the patron, who had now been paid for his drinks and his broken glasses, felt it incumbent to show his gallantry toward a splendid representative of French motherhood such as Jeanette, and so, without more ado, he spat at our feet and shoved us out of the door. "Shit on you, you dirty loafers," he said, or some such pleasantry. Once in the street and nobody throwing things after us, I began to see the funny side of it. It would be an excellent idea, I thought to myself, if the whole thing were properly aired in court. The whole thing. With Yvette's little stories as a side dish. After all, the French have a sense of humor. Perhaps the judge, when he heard Fillmore's side of the story, would absolve him from marriage. Meanwhile, Jeanette was standing across the street brandishing her fist and yelling at the top of her lungs. People were stopping to listen in, to take sides, as they do in street brawls. Fillmore didn't know what to do. Whether to walk away from her, or to go over to her and try to pacify her. He was standing in the middle of the street with his arms outstretched, trying to get a word in edgewise. And Jeanette still yelling, "Gangster! Brute! Two veras, salad!" and other complimentary things. Finally Fillmore made a move towards her and she, probably thinking that he was going to give her another good cuff, took it on a trot down the street. Fillmore came back to where I was standing and said, "Come on, let's follow her quietly." We started off with a thin crowd of stragglers behind us. Every once in a while, she turned back towards us and brandished her fist. We made no attempt to catch up with her, just followed her leisurely down the street to see what she would do. Finally she slowed up her pace and we crossed over to the other side of the street. She was quiet now. We kept walking behind her, getting closer and closer. There were only about a dozen people behind us. Now the others had lost interest. When we got near the corner she suddenly stopped and waited for us to approach. "Let me do the talking," said Fillmore, "I know how to handle her." The tears were streaming down her face as we came up to her. Myself, I didn't know what to expect of her. I was somewhat surprised therefore. When Fillmore walked up to her and said in an aggrieved voice, "Was that a nice thing to do? Why did you act that way?" Whereupon she threw her arms around his neck and began to weep like a child, calling him her little this and her little that. Then she turned to me imploringly. "You saw how he struck me," she said. "Is that the way to behave towards a woman?" I was on the point of saying yes when Fillmore took her by the arm and started leading her off. "No more of that," he said. "If you start again I'll crack you right here in the street." I thought it was going to start up all over again. She had fire in her eyes. But evidently she was a bit cowed, too, for it subsided quickly. However, as she sat down at the cafe she said quietly and grimly that he needn't think it was going to be forgotten so quickly, he'd hear more about it later on, perhaps tonight. And sure enough she kept her word. When I met him the next day his face and hands were all scratched up. Seems she had waited until he got to bed. And then, without a word, she had gone to the wardrobe and, dumping all His things out on the floor, she took them one by one and tore them to ribbons. As this had happened a number of times before, and as she had always sewn them up afterwards, he hadn't protested very much. And that made her angrier than ever. What she wanted was to get her nails into him. And she did, to the best of her ability. Being pregnant, she had a certain advantage over him. Poor Fillmore. It was no laughing matter. She had him terrorized. If he threatened to run away, she retorted by a threat to kill him. And she said it as if she meant it. If you go to America, she said, I'll follow you. You won't get away from me. A French girl always knows how to get vengeance. And the next moment she would be coaxing him to be reasonable, to be sage, etc. Life would be so nice once they had the stationery store. He wouldn't have to do a stroke of work. She would do everything. He could stay in back of the store and write or whatever he wanted to do. It went on like this, back and forth, a seesaw, for a few weeks or so. I was avoiding them as much as possible, sick of the affair and disgusted with the both of them. Then one fine summer's day, just as I was passing the credit Lyonnaise, who comes marching down the steps but Fillmore. I greeted him warmly, feeling rather guilty because I had dodged him for so long. I asked him, with more than ordinary curiosity, how things were going. He answered me rather vaguely and with a note of despair in his voice. I've just gotten permission to go to the bank, he said, in a peculiar, broken, abject sort of way. I've got about half an hour, no more. She keeps tabs on me. And he grasped my arm as if to hurry me away from the spot. We were walking down towards the Rue de Rivoli. It was a beautiful day. Warm, clear, sunny, one of those days when Paris is at its best. A mild, pleasant breeze blowing, just enough to take that stagnant odor out of your nostrils. Fillmore was without a hat. Outwardly he looked the picture of health, like the average American tourist who slouches along with money jingling in his pockets. I don't know what to do anymore, he said quietly. You've got to do something for me. I'm helpless. I can't get a grip on myself. If I could only get away from her for a little while, perhaps I'd come round all right. But she won't let me out of her sight. I just got permission to run to the bank. I had to draw some money. I'll walk around with you a bit and then I must hurry back. She'll have lunch waiting for me. I listened to him quietly, thinking to myself that he did need someone to pull him out of the hole he was in. He had completely caved in, there wasn't a speck of courage left in him. He was just like a child who is beaten every day and doesn't know any more how to behave, except to cower and cringe. As we turned under the colonnade of the Rue de Rivoli, he burst out into a long diatribe against France. The famous arcaded facades in Rue de Rivoli extend for almost a mile. He was fed up with the French. I used to rave about them, he said, but that was all literature. I know them now. I know what they're really like. They're cruel and mercenary. At first it seems wonderful, because you have a feeling of being free. After a while it palls on you. Underneath it's all dead, there's no feeling, no sympathy, no friendship. They're selfish to the core. The most selfish people on earth. They think of nothing but money, money, money. And so God damned respectable, so bourgeois. That's what drives me nuts. When I see her mending my shirts I could club her. Always mending, mending. Saving, saving. Faux fair day economies. That's all I hear her say all day long. You hear it everywhere. Sois raisonnable, Monday chérie. Sois raisonnable. I don't want to be reasonable and logical. I hate it. I want to bust loose, I want to enjoy myself. I want to do something. I don't want to sit in a chair and talk all day long. Jesus, we've got our faults but we've got enthusiasm. It's better to make mistakes than not do anything. I'd rather be a bum in America than to be sitting pretty here. Maybe it's because I'm a Yankee. I was born in New England and I belong there, I guess. You can't become a European overnight. There's something in your blood that makes you different. It's the climate and everything. We see things with different eyes. We can't make ourselves over, however much we admire the French. We're Americans and we've got to remain Americans. Sure, I hate those puritanical buggers back home. I hate 'em with all my guts. But I'm one of them myself. I don't belong here. I'm sick of it. All along the arcade he went on like this. I wasn't saying a word. I let him spill it all out. It was good for him to get it off his chest. Just the same, I was thinking how strange it was that this same guy, had it been a year ago, would have been beating his chest like a gorilla and saying, "What a marvelous day! What a country! What a people!" And if an American had happened along and said one word against France, Fillmore would have flattened his nose. He would have died for France a year ago. I never saw a man who was so infatuated with a country, who was so happy under a foreign sky. It wasn't natural. When he said France, it meant wine, women, money in the pocket, easy come, easy go. It meant being a bad boy, being on a holiday. And then, when he had had his fling, when the tent top blew off, and he had a good look at the sky, he saw that it wasn't just a circus, but an arena, just like everywhere. And a damned grim one. I often used to think, when I heard him rave about glorious France, about liberty, and all that crap, what it would have sounded like to a French workman, could he have understood Fillmore's words. No wonder they think we're all crazy. We are crazy to them. We're just a pack of children. Senile idiots. What we call life is a 5 and 10 cent store romance. That enthusiasm underneath, what is it? That cheap optimism which turns the stomach of any ordinary European? It's illusion. No, illusion's too good a word for it. Illusion means something. No, it's not that, it's delusion. It's sheer delusion, that's what. We're like a herd of wild horses with blinders over our eyes. On the rampage. Stampede. Over the precipice. Bango. Anything that nourishes violence and confusion. On. No matter where. And foaming at the lips. All the while. Shouting hallelujah. Hallelujah. Why? God knows. It's in the blood. It's the climate. It's a lot of things. It's the end, too. We're pulling the Whole world down about our ears. We don't know why. It's our destiny. The rest is plain shit. At the Palais Royal I suggested that we stop and have a drink. He hesitated. A moment. I saw that he was worrying about her, about the lunch, about the bawling out he'd get. For Christ's sake, I said, forget about her for a while. I'm going to order something to drink and I want you to drink it. Don't worry, I'm going to get you out of this fucking mess. I ordered 2 stiff whiskeys. When he saw the whiskeys coming he smiled at me just like a child again. Down it, I said, and let's have another. This is going to do you good. I don't care what the doctor says this time, it'll be all right. Come on, down with it. He put it down all right, and while the garçon disappeared to fetch another round he looked at me with brimming eyes, as though I were the last friend in the world. His lips were twitching a bit, too. There was something he wanted to say to me and he didn't quite know how to begin. I looked at him easily, as though ignoring the appeal, and, shoving the saucers aside, I leaned over on my elbow and I said to him earnestly, "Look here, Fillmore. What is it you'd really like to do? Tell me." With that the tears gushed up and he blurted out, "I'd like to be home with my people. I'd like to hear English spoken." The tears were streaming down his face. He made no effort to brush them away. He just let everything gush forth. Jesus, I thought to myself, that's fine to have a release like that. Fine. To be a complete coward at least once in your life. To let go that way. Great. Great. It did me so much good to see him break down that way that I felt as though I could solve any problem. I felt courageous and resolute. I had 1,000 ideas in my head at once. "Listen," I said, bending still closer to him, "if you mean what you said, why don't you do it? Why don't you go? Do you know what I would do, if I were in your shoes? I'd go today. Yes, by Jesus, I mean it. I'd go right away. Without even saying goodbye to her. As a matter of fact, that's the only way you can go. She'd never let you say goodbye. You know that." The garçon came with the whiskies. I saw him reach forward with a desperate eagerness and raise the glass to his lips. I saw a glint of hope in his eyes, far off, wild, desperate. He probably saw himself swimming across the Atlantic. To me it looked easy, simple as rolling off a log. The whole thing was working itself out rapidly in my mind. I knew just what each step would be. Clear as a bell, I was. "Whose money is that in the bank?" I asked. "Is it her father's or is it yours?" "It's mine," he exclaimed. "My mother sent it to me. I don't want any of her goddamned money." "That's swell," I said. "Listen, suppose we hop a cab and go back there. Draw out every cent. Then we'll go to the British consulate and get a visa. You're going to hop the train this afternoon for London. From London you'll take the first boat to America. I'm saying that because then you won't be worried about her trailing you. She'll never suspect that you went via London. If she goes searching for you, she'll naturally go to Le Havre first, or Cherbourg. And here's another thing, you're not going back to get your things. You're going to leave everything here. Let her keep them. With that French mind Of hers she'll never dream that you scooted off without bag or baggage. It's incredible. A Frenchman would never dream of doing a thing like that. Unless he was as cracked as you are. You're right. He exclaimed. I never thought of that. Besides, you might send them to me later on if she'll surrender them. But that doesn't matter. Now. Jesus, though, I haven't even got a hat. What do you need a hat for? When you get to London you can buy everything you need. All you need now is to hurry. We've got to find out when the train leaves. Listen, he said, reaching for his wallet, I'm going to leave everything to you. Here, take this and do whatever's necessary. I'm too weak. I'm dizzy. I took the wallet and emptied it of the bills he had just drawn from the bank. A cab was standing at the curb. We hopped in. There was a train leaving the Gare du Nord at 4 o'clock, or thereabouts. I was figuring it out. The bank, the consulate, the American Express, the station. Fine. Just about. Make it. Now buck up, I said. And keep your shirt on. Shit, in a few hours you'll be crossing the channel. Tonight you'll be walking around in London and you'll get a good belly full of English. Tomorrow you'll be on the open sea and then, by Jesus, you're a free man and you needn't give a fuck what happens. By the time you get to New York this'll be nothing more than a bad dream. This got him so excited that his feet were moving convulsively, as if he were trying to run inside the cab. At the bank his hand was trembling so that he could hardly sign his name. That was one thing I couldn't do for him, sign his name. But I think, had it been necessary, I could have sat him on the toilet and wiped his ass. I was determined to ship him off, even if I had to fold him up and put him in a valise. It was lunch hour when we got to the British consulate, and the place was closed. That meant waiting until 2 o'clock. I couldn't think of anything better to do, by way of killing time, than to eat. Fillmore, of course, wasn't hungry. He was for eating a sandwich. Fuck that, I said. You're going to blow me to a good lunch. It's the last square meal you're going to have over here maybe for a long while. I steered him to a cozy little restaurant and ordered a good spread. I ordered the best wine on the menu, regardless of price or taste. I had all his money in my pocket, oodles of it, it seemed to me. Certainly never before had I had so much in my fist at one time. It was a treat to break 1,000-franc note. I held it up to the lights first to look at the beautiful watermark. Beautiful money. One of the few things the French make on a grand scale. Artistically done, too, as if they cherished a deep affection even for the symbol. The meal over, we went to a cafe. I ordered chartreuse with the coffee. Why not? And I broke another bill, a 500-franc note this time. It was a clean, new, crisp bill. A pleasure to handle such money. The waiter handed me back a lot of dirty old bills that had been patched up with strips of gummed paper. I had a stack of 5 and 10-franc notes in a bag full of chicken feed. Chinese money, with holes in it. I didn't know in which pocket to stuff the money anymore. My trousers were bursting with coins and bills. It made me Slightly uncomfortable also, hauling all that dough out in public. I was afraid we might be taken for a couple of crooks. When we got to the American Express, there wasn't a devil of a lot of time left. The British, in their usual fumbling, farting way, had kept us on pins and needles. Here everybody was sliding around on casters. They were so speedy that everything had to be done twice. After all the checks were signed and clipped together in a neat little holder, it was discovered that he had signed in the wrong place. Nothing to do but start all over again. I stood over him, with one eye on the clock, and watched every stroke of the pen. It hurt to hand over the dough. Not all of it, thank God, but a good part of it. I had roughly about 2,500 francs in my pocket. Roughly, I say. I wasn't counting by francs anymore. 100, or 200, more or less, it didn't mean a goddamned thing to me. As for him, he was going through the whole transaction in a daze. He didn't know how much money he had. All he knew was that he had to keep something aside for Jeanette. He wasn't certain yet how much we were going to figure that out on the way to the station. In the excitement we had forgotten to change all the money. We were already in the cab, however, and there wasn't any time to be lost. The thing was to find out how we stood. We emptied our pockets quickly and began to whack it up. Some of it was lying on the floor, some of it was on the seat. It was bewildering. There was French, American, and English money. And all that chicken feed besides. I felt like picking up the coins and chucking them out of the window just to simplify matters. Finally we sifted it all out. He held on to the English and American money, and I held on to the French money. We had to decide quickly now what to do about Jeanette, how much to give her, what to tell her, etc. He was trying to fix up a yam for me to hand her, didn't want her to break her heart, and so forth. I had to cut him short. Never mind what to tell her, I said. Leave that to me. How much are you going to give her? That's the thing. Why give her anything? That was like setting a bomb under his ass. He burst into tears. Such tears. It was worse than before. I thought he was going to collapse on my hands. Without stopping to think, I said, all right, let's give her all this French money. That ought to last her for a while. How much is it? He asked feebly. I don't know, about 2,000 francs or so. More than she deserves anyway. Christ! Don't say that. He begged. After all, it's a rotten break I'm giving her. Her folks'll never take her back now. No, give it to her. Give her the whole damned business. I don't care what it is. He pulled a handkerchief out to wipe the tears away. I can't help it, he said. It's too much for me. I said nothing. Suddenly he sprawled himself out full length. I thought he was taking a fit or something, and he said, Jesus, I think I ought to go back. I ought to go back and face the music. If anything should happen to her, I'd never forgive myself. That was a rude jolt for me. Christ! I shouted, you can't do that. Not now. It's too late. You're going to take the train, and I'm going to tend to her myself. I'll go see her just as soon as I leave you. Why, you poor boob, if she ever thought you had tried to run away from her, she'd murder you, don't you realize that? You can't go back anymore. It's settled. Anyway, what could go wrong? I asked myself. Kill herself? Tant mieux. When we rolled up to the station, we had still about 12 minutes to kill. I didn't dare to say goodbye to him yet. At the last minute, rated as he was, I could see him jumping off the train and scooting back to her. Anything might swerve him. A straw. So I dragged him across the street to a bar and I said, now you're going to have a Pernod, your last Pernod, and I'm going to pay for it, with your dough. Something about this remark made him look at me uneasily. He took a big gulp of the Pernod and then, turning to me like an injured dog, he said, I know I oughtn't to trust you with all that money, but, oh, well, do what you think best. I don't want her to kill herself, that's all. Kill herself, I said. Not her. You must think a hell of a lot of yourself if you can believe a thing like that. As for the money, though I hate to give it to her, I promise you I'll go straight to the post office and telegraph it to her. I wouldn't trust myself with it a minute longer than is necessary. As I said this, I spied a bunch of postcards in a revolving rack. I grabbed one off a picture of the Eiffel Tower it was, and made him write a few words. Tell her you're sailing now. Tell her you love her and that you'll send for her as soon as you arrive. I'll send it by pneumatique when I go to the post office. Pneumatic post cylinders, new and old, showing the electrically conducting bands introduced after 1931. Pneumatique. A scene inside a telegraph offices, where 50 million letters passed every year. And tonight I'll see her. Everything'll be all right, Jake, you'll see. With that we walked across the street to the station. Only 2 minutes to go. I felt it was safe now. At the gate I gave him a slap on the back and pointed to the train. I didn't shake hands with him, he would have slobbered all over me. I just said, hurry. She's going in a minute. And with that I turned on my heel and marched off. I didn't even look round to see if he was boarding the train. I was afraid to. I hadn't really thought, all the while I was bundling him off, what I'd do once I was free of him. I had promised a lot of things, but that was only to keep him quiet. As for facing Jeanette, I had about as little courage for it as he had. I was getting panicky myself. Everything had happened so quickly that it was impossible to grasp the nature of the situation in full. I walked away from the station in a kind of delicious stupor with the postcard in my hand. I stood against a lamp post and read it over. It sounded preposterous. I read it again, to make sure that I wasn't dreaming, and then I tore it up and threw it in the gutter. I looked around uneasily, half expecting to see Jeanette coming after me with a tomahawk. Nobody was following me. I started walking leisurely towards the Place Lafayette. It was a beautiful day, as I had observed earlier. Light, puffy clouds above, sailing with the wind. The awnings flapping. Paris had never looked so good to me. I almost felt sorry that I had shipped the poor bugger off. At the Place Lafayette I sat down facing the church and stared. At the clock tower, it's not such a wonderful piece of architecture, but that blue in the dial face always fascinated me. It was bluer than ever today. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Unless he were crazy enough to write her a letter, explaining everything, Jeanette need never know what had happened. And even if she did learn that he had left her 2,500 francs or so, she couldn't prove it. I could always say that he imagined it. A guy who was crazy enough to walk off without even a hat was crazy enough to invent the 2,500 francs. Or whatever it was. How much was it, anyhow, I wondered. My pockets were sagging with the weight of it. I hauled it all out and counted it carefully. There was exactly 2,875 francs and 35 centimes. More than I had thought. The 75 francs and 35 centimes had to be gotten rid of. I wanted an even sum, a clean 2,800 francs. Just then I saw a cab pulling up to the curb. A woman stepped out with a white poodle dog in her hands. The dog was peeing over her silk dress. The idea of taking a dog for a ride got me sore. I'm as good as her dog, I said to myself, and with that I gave the driver a sign and told him to drive me through the bois. He wanted to know where exactly. Anywhere, I said. Go through the bois, go all around it and take your time, I'm in no hurry. I sank back and let the houses whiz by, the jagged roofs, the chimney pots, the colored walls, the urinals, the dizzy carrefours. 244 passing the Rond Point, I thought I'd go downstairs and take a leak. No telling what might happen down there. I told the driver to wait. It was the first time in my life I had let a cab wait while I took a leak. How much can you waste that way? Not very much. With what I had in my pocket, I could afford to have 2 taxis waiting for me. I took a good look around, but I didn't see anything worthwhile. What I wanted was something fresh and unused, something from Alaska or the Virgin Islands. A clean fresh pelt with a natural fragrance to it. Needless to say, there wasn't anything like that walking about. I wasn't terribly disappointed. I didn't give a fuck whether I found anything or not. The thing is, never to be too anxious. Everything comes in due time. We drove on past the Arc de Triomphe. A few sightseers were loitering around the remains of the unknown soldier. Going through the bois, I looked at all the rich cunts promenading in their limousines. They were whizzing by as if they had some destination. Do that, no doubt, to look important, to show the world how smooth run their Rolls Royces and their Hispano-Suizes. Inside me things were running smoother than any Rolls Royce ever ran. It was just like velvet inside. Velvet cortex and velvet vertebrae. And velvet axle grease, what? It's a wonderful thing, for half an hour, to have money in your pocket and piss it away like a drunken sailor. You feel as though the world is yours. And the best part of it is, you don't know what to do with it. You can sit back and let the meter run wild, you can let the wind blow through your hair, you can stop and have a drink, you can give a big tip, and you can swagger off as though it were an everyday occurrence. But you Rolls-Royce's 1930 Hispano-Suizes 1930 can't create a revolution. You can't wash all the dirt out of your belly. When We got to the Port d'Autuil. I made him head for the Seine. At the Pont de Sèvres I got out and started walking along the river, toward the Autuil viaduct. It's about the size of a creek along here and the trees come right down to the river's bank. The water was green and glassy, especially near the other side. Now and then a scow chugged by. Bathers in tights were standing in the grass sunning themselves. Everything was close and palpitant, and vibrant with the strong light. Passing a beer garden I saw a group of cyclists sitting at a table. I took a seat nearby and ordered a demi. Hearing them jabber away I thought for a moment of Jeanette. I saw her stamping up and down the room, tearing her hair, and sobbing and bleeding, in that beast-like way of hers. I saw his hat on the rack. I wondered if his clothes would fit me. He had a Raglan 245 that I particularly liked. Well, by now he was on his way. In a little while the boat would be rocking under him. English. He wanted to hear English spoken. What an idea! Suddenly it occurred to me that if I wanted I could go to America myself. It was the first time the opportunity had ever presented itself. I asked myself, "Do you want to go?" There was no answer. My thoughts drifted out towards the sea, towards the other side where, taking a last look back, I had seen the skyscrapers fading out in a flurry of snowflakes. I saw them looming up again, in that same ghostly way as when I left. Saw the lights creeping through their ribs. I saw the whole city spread out, from Harlem to the Battery, the streets choked with ants, the elevated rushing by, the theaters emptying. I wondered in a vague way what had ever happened to my wife. After everything had quietly sifted through my head a great peace came over me. Here, where the river gently winds through the girdle of hills, lies a soil so saturated with the past that however far back the mind roams one can never detach it from its human background. Christ, before my eyes, there shimmered such a golden peace that only a neurotic could dream of. Turning his head away, so quietly flows the Seine that one hardly notices its presence. It is always there, quiet and unobtrusive, like a great artery running through the human body. In the wonderful peace that fell over me, it seemed as if I had climbed to the top of a high mountain. For a little while I would be able to look around me, to take in the meaning of the landscape. Human beings make a strange fauna and flora. From a distance they appear negligible, close up they are apt to appear ugly and malicious. More than anything they need to be surrounded with sufficient space even more than time. The sun is setting. I feel this river flowing through me, its past, its ancient soil, the changing climate. The hills gently girdle it about, its course is fixed. The end. Thank for watching this audio book on Romantic Flames audiobooks.